Terrific Thursday to each of you, and welcome to the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. Grizzlies basketball is back as they look to take on the Minnesota Timberwolves tonight in what could be, in all honesty, what could be a playoff matchup for the Grizzlies. But when it comes to the fact that though the playoffs are 6 or 7 weeks away, what specifically do the Grizzlies really need to focus on? Elaborating more on what I've talked about in the past when it comes to how things may have to change for the Grizzlies when it comes to the playoffs and why Jaren Jackson Jr. truly is the key to ultimately lead to this team hopefully having the special season it wants to have. Plus a preview of tonight's game. Let's get it going.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, one and all, to the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. My name, as always, is Shawn Coleman. It is a pleasure to be with you, as always. I'm a credentialed media member with the Grizzlies, have been covering the Grizzlies now for 4 years, right for them over at Grizzly Bear Blues, and your host here at Locked On Grizzlies, your Grizzlies every day. Of course, you can find the show wherever you enjoy podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, the Odyssey app, as well as here on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button below. Thank you for all the support. We always love seeing folks enjoy the show. Always love folks being able to find the show who enjoy good Grizzlies coverage, and more than anything, just want the show to be the best experience it possibly could be. So obviously the Memphis Grizzlies are back in play tonight. And if you got to enjoy the show from Tuesday, in which I talked with Brandon Clean of Locked On Suns and David Locke of Locked On of the Locked On Jazz podcast and so on, we talked with everybody that was a part of the four top teams in the West, the Warriors, the Jazz, the Suns, and the Grizzlies, obviously. And there are a couple of similarities that really stand out. You've got four teams that are led by their guards offensively. Conley and Mitchell with the Jazz, Paul and Booker with the Suns, Poole and Thompson and Curry with the Warriors. Woo, I evidently need to wake up. And then, of course, John Morant and Desmond Bane with the Grizzlies. But you also have differing styles of play. Obviously, the Suns have been an absolute Goliath when it comes to this season. Top three in defense, top three in offense. Obviously, the Warriors have Steph Curry. The Utah Jazz have a very methodical approach that works when everybody is healthy. And, of course, the Grizzlies, when it comes to their success, what really helps them stand out is their ability to out-activity everybody. So there are similarities, but also there are differences as to why each of these teams are having success right now in the regular season. The Grizzlies, first in field goal attempts per game, first in offensive rebounds, first in rebounding, first in blocks, first in steals. The Grizzlies are finding multiple ways, night in and night out, to regularly produce a significantly higher amount of overall field goal attempts than their opponents, especially two-point field goal attempts, and that's how the Grizzlies are winning games, and they're winning games soundly. But they're also coupling that with a top 10 defense right now, a defense that ranks 9th in the NBA in defensive rating, and a defense that a lot of times can play to a top 5 level, and that hopefully will especially be easier to occur once Dillon Brooks returns. Of course, it's helped out by Jaren Jackson Jr., now emerging as a true Defensive Player of the Year All-Defensive Team candidate. That works perfectly in the regular season. And that's why when you have heard me talk, for instance, I talked this morning with Greg Gaston on Sports 56. I mentioned it a few other times. The Grizzlies have figured out how to consistently maximize the strengths of their roster during the regular season. I will say they figured out the regular season. I don't necessarily know if that's, I'm not as confident in that, saying it now a few times over. But my point is that the challenge for this team, for this Grizzlies team, is no longer making the playoffs. They're going to do it for 2 straight years. And this time they're going to do it as potentially a top 3 team in the West. That seems very likely. But the thing that stands out is this, is that if the Grizzlies are going to continue to play basketball the way that they do, outdoing teams on the hustle and the paint on the boards, if they're going to continue to do that, they're also going to have to keep up their ability to create turnovers, to play opportunistic defense, while also being very good at stopping the three. That's what's made the difference between the games against Denver this year and Dallas this year when it comes to potential playoff matchups for the Grizzlies. I've spoke about that a few times as well. Against Denver, The Grizzlies, though Denver did slow down the Grizzlies' overall effectiveness on the hustle in the paint and off turnovers, what the Grizzlies did well, they shot the three well, and they defended the three well. The Grizzlies played a style of basketball that works in the playoffs when their opponent takes away the main source of success. They were able to do that against Denver. But against Dallas, who the Grizzlies are 1-3 against this year, Dallas was perfectly fine with the Grizzlies doing what they needed to do. They were perfectly fine with letting the Grizzlies do what they needed to do out on the run. But what they did was they made it very hard for the Grizzlies to operate in the half court, and the Grizzlies struggle from shooting the three while also struggling, preventing Dallas from shooting the three. So that's what stood out, and that's why against two playoff teams, there has been a significant difference in success. Denver stopped the Grizzlies from doing what they regularly do, but the Grizzlies were able to adjust, shoot the three, defend the three, pass the basketball well when they needed to, and also a great job at creating their own shots. And that's what helped them win those games. But against Dallas, while the Grizzlies were able to do what they regularly do on offense, they struggled on defense and shooting the three, and that's what wound up costing them in those games. And another reason why I point out that the Grizzlies are going to need to really start to focus on shooting the three better, defending the three better, making their free throws, half-court offense, passing the basketball, is because as good as the Grizzlies are at activity, their overall effectiveness with that activity, execution, it still has room for improvement. Because with the Grizzlies being first in many activity categories, they're also 24th in they're 24th in effective field goal percentage, 24th in true shooting percentage, and they're in the bottom 7 of the league, both shooting the three in terms of three-pointers made per game, as well as three-point percentage. The Grizzlies are very good at what they do. On the hustle, in the paint, creating turnovers on the boards. But if those things are limited, and there is going to be a good chance that those things are more limited against good teams, especially as you get deeper in the playoffs, it becomes even more important for the Grizzlies to do what they need to do to win the game. In other words, what I'm saying is this, is that whether it's a Minnesota or a Dallas or a Denver, the Grizzlies are going to face a team in the playoff, even in the first round of the playoffs. Even if the Grizzlies are the number 2 seed and they play the number 7 seed, the Grizzlies are going to face a team in the playoff that is there because of adjustments that they've made. While the Grizzlies are very good at the one thing that they do, which is out-activity, which is being able to out-activity everybody, while the Grizzlies are very good at that, the thing is that also is something that whoever they face in the first round and beyond potentially, that's what that team's going to focus on doing. Whoever the Grizzlies' opponents is in the playoffs, they're going to look to do two things. They're going to look to take away the paint, and they're going to look to take away Ja Morant. And at that point, the areas that I mentioned where the Grizzlies have struggled, when it comes to their shot selection overall as a team, when it comes to their ability to shoot the three, when it comes to the ability to pass like they have in the past, when it comes to their ability to defend the three, those things are going to become more important as a team makes adjustments in taking away the Grizzlies' strengths in the playoffs. Look at last year. The Grizzlies in the playoffs, they averaged the most field goal attempts per game of any playoff team in last year's playoff, just like they are doing now in this regular season. But they were also in the bottom 5 of the teams in the playoffs in shooting the three. But the other thing that stood out, they were also in the bottom 5 of defense of all teams that were in the playoffs last year. So if the Grizzlies are going to continue to operate like they are right now on offense and scoring points in the regular season, they're going to have to be a top 5 defensive team in the playoffs. That's what's going to lead them to success. If that was not to be the case, though, if they were to not be a top 5 team, or if they are a top 5 team, what's going to be even better than the way they're operating on offense now is if they can also shoot and defend the three, make their free throws, and play good half-court offense. That's what stands out. So when the Grizzlies go through the next 6 or 7 weeks, even if they have the 28th, even if they have the third easiest schedule in the NBA, the point is, and especially once Dillon Brooks comes back, the point is to take that manageable schedule and develop the ability to, while you're doing the things that you do well, on the hustle, in the paint, off the boards, creating turnovers, Keep doing those things. But also get consistent in stretches at being able to shoot the three well, being able to defend the three well, pass the basketball, and make free throws. Because while it's great that you can consistently do the things that are helping you win in the regular season, the things that the Grizzlies are struggling with right now, they're going to become more critical to do well in the playoffs because you're going to be facing opponents who are going to be more effective at taking away the things that you can do well. I'm not necessarily saying they're going to stop Ja Morant, but I am saying that the Grizzlies are going to have to complement Ja Morant with very efficient and effective offensive and defensive play from their entire team. You've got the components to do it this year. You absolutely do. You are much better suited to do it this year than you were in last year's playoffs. But the key is getting consistent at doing it and knowing when it's going to be important to do it, especially as you go game 1, game 2, game 3, and so on. And the team that you're facing is making adjustments to take away more effectively the things you do well and putting pressure on the things that you don't do well. The Grizzlies do a lot of things well. The Grizzlies do a lot of things at a very highly effective rate. The key, though, is for the specific things that they need to do in the playoffs. Shooting and defending the three, playing good overall defense, passing the basketball, shooting free throws. Those are areas where the Grizzlies can certainly improve. The key is to take advantage of the manageable schedule they have over the next 6 to 7 weeks and do that and prove to the point that they can be consistent to where it's going to be more critical to do those things in the playoffs. The Grizzlies will be able to do them when the time comes. But there are several players who obviously can contribute to improving in those areas. Ja, Desmond, Dillon when he gets back. Obviously, Steven Adams, Kyle Anderson, the rest, so on and so forth. But there's one player, in my opinion, who really does need to step up, not in terms of the fact that he's not playing well right now, but just when it comes to over the next several weeks leading into the playoffs, the play of Jaren Jackson Jr., I think the consistency of his offensive play, I think is going to be crucial to the Grizzlies really moving far in the playoffs. We'll discuss that in just a moment. Before we do, I want to talk with you a bit more about BetOnline.net. BetOnline.net is a great place for you to go to be able to bet on all the things that you enjoy betting on. Now, listen, I know that right now football's over, but we still have the NHL, pro and college hoops. We've got the UFC, boxing, whatever you enjoy when it comes to betting and wagering on sports. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. Of course, we want to thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen of the day. On tomorrow's Locked On Grizzlies podcast, we'll review the game against the Timberwolves. Again, a very, very effective test for the Grizzlies right out of the All-Star break, plus preview the game this weekend against the Chicago Bulls. 2 back-to-back games against 2 very formidable opponents for the Grizzlies to really put them to the test out of the gate into the second half of the season. That and much more on tomorrow's edition of the Locked On Grizzlies podcast. So Jaren Jackson Jr., without a shadow of a doubt, has had a spectacular first half of the season. You could easily say, in my opinion, he was one of the top 20 players who were most deserving of a playoff spot, of an all-star spot on the Western Conference All-Star team. He is rightfully seen his stock skyrocket in terms of the Defensive Player of the Year conversation as well as all defensive team conversation with how special of a defensive impact month he had in January. And he's again picked it up here in February as well. And I talked about it yesterday. I talked about the fact that right now in front of him in the odds over at betonline.net, you've got Draymond Green, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Rudy Gobert. And the thing that stands out, the reason why those guys are above him, those guys are effective defensively, but they also, and here's a big key, they also have pedigree on their side. They have reputation on their side. That typically matters. That typically is a shifting point that will allow, if you're looking at 1 or 2 players to choose from, 2 or 3 players to choose from in an award, what will go in a player's favor is already having a reputation or a pedigree for that specific award. Jaren Jackson Jr. doesn't have that as of yet, but he's developing that this season. But for me, the big key for the Grizzlies is Jaren continuing to do that, continuing to anchor the Grizzlies defense. And then when you have Dillon Brooks coming back from injury, you've had proof earlier this year. Though, yes, it was against a pretty soft part of the schedule. But when Dillon Brooks and Jaren Jackson Jr. were on the court together, that perimeter presence of Dillon on the main score on the perimeter for the opposing offense, and then Jaren anchoring the defense and protecting the rim as well as he can overall for the Grizzlies defense, that combination really does give the Grizzlies a chance to play like a top 5 defense any night of the week. That's how good that combination is when they're on the court together. Because again, it allows for everybody else to fall into their roles. Then you've got the opportunistic nature of the Grizzlies bench. You've got the three-point defense potentially being as good as possible. You've got the confidence up and down the roster of players knowing they have Dylan on the outside, Jaren on the inside to back them up. So they're able to be more aggressive, but also be smarter when it comes to their fulfilling their roles in defensive coverages. So Jaren continuing to play as good as he can as a defensive anchor, that is a huge key for the Grizzlies in the playoffs. Because again, as I mentioned, if the Grizzlies go into the playoffs, once they get past this 6 or 7 weeks, and once they arrive at the playoffs, if the Grizzlies are going to struggle again shooting the three, if they're going to be playing very similar in the playoffs on offense as they are now, where the three-point shot is inconsistent at best, then the Grizzlies are going to have to make up for their lack of three-point shooting by playing some of the best defense in the NBA. That's just going to be essential for them to move on. Last year, they didn't do it because their defense really faltered when they played the well-oiled machine that was the Utah Jazz. So if the Grizzlies want to continue to play their style of basketball they're playing now, then they better complement it with a top 5 level defense. And with Jaren playing like he can, at an all-defensive player level, along with Dylan being back, they certainly can do that. But the big key, as I mentioned, is the Grizzlies being able to couple a defense that can play at a top 5 level any night of the week, while also having a team that can balance out their paint attack with effective three-point shooting. We know that Desmond Bane has emerged as one of the top 10 shooters in the league. I've said it all year. It's been deserved. Desmond is incredible when it comes to the three-point shot. We know that John Morant can go through stretches. He's a very streaky three-point shooter. He can be cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot, cold, hot. DeAnthony Melton is the same way. Tyus Jones has certainly been effective. You hope that once Dylan Brooks comes back, who has shown stretches, though they've been small, but stretches this year of improved three-point shooting, you hope that he can become a good three-point outlet per game. But for me, the key for the Grizzlies to start to have the depth that they need, to have multiple reliable options on the outside to support their paint game, and especially Ja in the lane, is Jaren Jackson Jr. shooting the three. Just under 32% from the year, 1.7 threes per game, 4.8 threes attempted per game. To me, the thing that I would love to see, Jaren is now at around 35.8% for his career shooting the three. Imagine if he could simply shoot that level for the rest of the year. Yes, we'd love to see him shooting nearly 40% on threes on nearly 6.5 attempts per game like he did when he was a 20-year-old 2 years ago. That may not happen this year. It may be a result of the fact that Jaren puts in the energy that he does on the defensive end. But if we could at least get 2 threes regularly from Jaren while shooting 36 to 38% from three, that would be a huge compliment, a huge improvement from where he is now to support Desmond Bane, and hopefully the rest of the team can come in and support as well. Because that's the key for Jaren and the Grizzlies, is that if he can balance out his defensive approach with good offense, it leads to good results. Here are a couple of examples. Jaren Jackson Jr. has scored 20 points or more in 21 games this year, and he's been doing it a lot more as of late as well. When Jaren scores 20 or more points this year, the Grizzlies are 18-3. When Jaren makes 3 or more threes in a game this year, the Grizzlies are 13-2. In other words, when Jaren Jackson Jr. is being the third wheel to Ja and Desmond on offense while also putting together the defensive impact he can make, the Grizzlies are very, very tough to beat. And that's why, in my opinion, he's the biggest key to this Grizzlies team having the success they want to this year. Because if he can anchor a defense that can play like a top 10, top 5 defense on any given night, but also can complement that by being a balanced source of offense, especially from the outside, to complement Bane and complement Jaren, or to complement Ja, you see the results. When he does that, in the 21 times where he's done that this year, the Grizzlies are 18-3. That's a pretty darn good level of basketball to play. And playing basketball at that level, I imagine that if the Grizzlies can get that type of contribution from Jaren on offense, you'll see them at least win their first round series. So that's why Jaren Jackson is the key. His obvious impact on defense, that's as consistent as it can be. That's what has helped him emerge as one of the best defenders in the league. But if he can at least complement it, he doesn't have to take over games. But if he could just get 10 to 15 shots per game. Get 5 or more three-pointers per game and throw in multiple three-pointers. Throw in 18 to 22 points a night. If he can do that on a consistent basis, and again, it may not be every night, but if he can at least do that on a consistent basis, if he can show up to that level, it will be huge for Memphis. And the record shows just how huge it can be. So yes, Ja Morant is the Grizzlies' most important player. Yes, Desmond Bane, in my opinion, is their second most important player on offense. But overall, for this team to really get where it needs to get, where it will say this has truly been a special season, it's Jaren Jackson Jr. continuing to find the consistency on offense to complement his highly impactful defense that has made him one of the best defenders in the league. The perfect time to start all of this, though, is tonight against the Minnesota Timberwolves, who have been a pretty big thorn in the side of the Grizzlies so far this year. We'll discuss that in just a moment. But before we do, I want to talk with you about rockauto.com. Listen, we've had a lot of icy weather around here in the Mid-South. Just had it last night. And of course, when that occurs, when weather conditions are less than ideal, that could put some wear and tear on your car, which could lead to the need for parts. And rockauto.com is a great place. Number one, within a few clicks of the button online, you'll be able to find what you need, regardless of make and model, regardless of the part. rockauto.com is likely to have it. And they also are a family-owned business. They've been in business for over 20 years. They know that car parts a lot of times can be outside of your budget, so they make things as cost-effective as possible. When you visit rockauto.com, let them know the Locked On Podcast Network sent you. rockauto.com, amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the car parts you'll ever need. Visit rockauto.com today. Listen, we can't thank you enough for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen of the day, but we also want to make sure that you know to check out Locked On Fantasy Basketball with Josh Lloyd, the #1 fantasy basketball site in the world. I imagine that many leagues are either maybe even in their playoffs, but are at least or within a few weeks of their playoffs. So you want to check out some waiver wires to really pick up with all the activity after the trade deadline, buyouts, injuries, what have you. Josh Lloyd has you covered on Locked On Fantasy Basketball. So the Memphis Grizzlies face off against the Minnesota Timberwolves tonight. And the thing that I'll tell you is this, and it may surprise you a bit, this legitimately could be a first-round playoff matchup, and the likelihood of that may be bigger than you think. Right now, the Minnesota Timberwolves are currently stand in the 7th spot in the West. They're currently 2 games above the Clippers for the 7th spot in the West. It obviously means they're in the play-in game, so a lot could happen before the playoffs actually occur. But they're 2 games up in the 7th spot and 2.5 games behind the Nuggets, who are in the 6th spot. The Grizzlies are only a game and a half out of the 2nd spot in the West when it comes to the Warriors. And the Warriors have been struggling, and they're going to continue to be without some of their key players, at least initially, in the second half of the season. So my point is that it very much is a realistic possibility where you could see the Timberwolves and the Grizzlies facing off against each other in the first round of the playoffs. And while the Timberwolves may be a team that just from reputation leading up to this year, Grizzlies fans may see themselves saying, okay, yeah, I'm fine with that. I could see them being, one of the, easier first round matchups when you compare them to the Nuggets or the Mavericks or so on, or the 2 LA teams. I'll tell you this, it's actually the Timberwolves who have been one of the teams that have given this Grizzlies team the biggest struggle this year because of how frequent the Timberwolves shoot the three. That's the big change that's happened in Minnesota. You are seeing this team. They're the #1 team overall in 3-point attempts per game. And even though they're 19th in 3 points being made, they attempt so many threes that the quantity still shows out enough for them to win games. And they're also improving themselves when it comes to their defensive activity. The Timberwolves actually are causing the most turnovers to their opponents of any team in the NBA right now. Yes, the Grizzlies lead in steals, the Grizzlies lead in blocks per games, but it's the Timberwolves who lead in most turnovers created by their opponent, or who lead to the most forced turnovers to their opponent per game. 16.5 times per game, the Timberwolves are causing turnovers. So not only are they coupling a highly proficient attack in terms of activity from 3, they're also 4th in the NBA in field goal attempts. If we want to talk about the Grizzlies out using more activity to lead to more field goal attempts against their opposition as a way for them to have success, the Timberwolves are doing their version of it. They may not be creating as many field goal attempts per game, but they are having a lot more success from 3 in terms of shooting them overall than the Grizzlies. So that's why Minnesota has been a bit of a thorn in the side of the Grizzlies. They're very close to playing like the Grizzlies do in terms of letting defense turn into offense, being opportunistic on defense, and using, a lot of activity to create more field goal attempts per game than their opponent. But Minnesota throws in the ability to shoot the three. Now, the reason why that's from offense, the reason on defense, the big reason why the Grizzlies are, have a much better record than Minnesota right now is because of defense, where the Grizzlies are much more effective, especially inside the arc, defending shots than the Timberwolves are. But the key for the Grizzlies tonight is the same thing that has caused them trouble basically over the past year and a half when it comes to facing Minnesota. It's the trio of D'Angelo Russell, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Anthony Edwards. And it just seems like every time the Grizzlies play the Timberwolves, those three players, and even Malik Beasley, when you throw him in, if one of those players were to not play or have an off night, it just always seems as if when the Grizzlies play the Timberwolves have a trio of players who are in the 25 to 35 range in points, and you've got to combine 75 to 80 or above points from just three players on the Timberwolves, and that's very hard for any team to overcome. So the key for the Grizzlies tonight is going to be the defense of their starting unit. And of course, you don't have Dillon Brooks back. You've been seeing the Grizzlies start Ja, Desmond, Zaire, Jaren, and Steven Adams. And while Zaire's defense is certainly improving, this is definitely a test with how well Karl-Anthony Towns is shooting the three, how frequently Russell and Edwards are shooting the three, but also just the overall quantity of attempts that trio can create. And then you've got Beasley and others, plus Jared Vanderbilt, who leads the defense very well. You've got a very complimentary roster of a complimentary roster of players in Minnesota that easily, if they're hitting their shots, can be a tough night for anybody. So tonight for the Grizzlies, their ability to do what they do well, getting offensive rebounds, creating turnovers, those things, getting out on the run, those things are going to be essential to them winning this game. But the big key also tonight, and it's tracked with when they've won versus the Minnesota over the past, Darren Taylor Jenkins era versus when they haven't, the Grizzlies are going to have to shoot and defend the three well. And they're also going to have to make their free throws. Minnesota is going to put the pressure on the Grizzlies by shooting the three frequently. They're going to put the pressure on the Grizzlies by giving their trio of players. Minnesota is going to get their three best players plenty of shot opportunities. Can the Grizzlies contest those shots? Can they prevent second opportunities? Can they take care of the basketball? Can they make their own threes? Those are the big questions to answer. You know what's going to happen with Minnesota. They're going to shoot a bunch of threes. They're going to get those shot attempts to Edwards, Russell, and Towns, and they're going to also try their best to create offense through defense. If the Grizzlies can take care of the basketball, defend and shoot the three well, and take care of their business in the paint, that's been the key for the Grizzlies, is that they have nearly averaged, I believe, over the past 5 games against Minnesota, 65 to 75 points in the paint. They've contested Minnesota's attempt to attack the Grizzlies from three by being able to get into the lane and be successful. If the Grizzlies can shoot the three well, but they can get into the lane and be successful and still defend the three well, that's another route that they can win. But again, it comes back to the Grizzlies taking care of the basketball and defending the three well. If they can do those two things, whether they have success from three or they have success in the paint, that's how the Grizzlies can win tonight's game. They've done it before. They can do it again. It's just going to be a true test against a Minnesota team that truly has emerged as one of the bigger threats to have a surprise win in the playoffs. I'm not lying to you. If the Timberwolves were to get hot from three over a stretch in the playoffs, they certainly could pull off a surprise upset in the first round of the playoffs. I truly do think that. At the end of the day, the Golden State and Phoenix certainly are going to be hard to do that against, but I do think that Minnesota is going to be a very tough first round matchup for someone. But if you can defend the three against them and you can take care of the basketball, that makes it to where they're going to have to beat you with highly effective half-court offense. But if the Grizzlies can do that, they know that against Minnesota, they can score in the paint. The key is to do the other things well. Again, play good defense and take care of the basketball to where if the Grizzlies want to win how they normally win, do those few things well, and then take what you can with how you normally find success, and that should lead to a win. Going to be a fun night. Going to be a very fun night again, featuring two of the better young cores in the NBA, Anthony Edwards and Ja Morant. Always are fun. Make sure you tune in. It will be the first half of the Grizzlies regular season, but first half of the Grizzlies first game to the Grizzlies' second half of the regular season, but what should be a really fun start to a fun stretch leading up to the 2022 playoffs. We'll be right back with you tomorrow, recapping all the action, plus looking forward to a weekend matchup against the Bulls. Have a great one, and we'll talk to you again soon here on the Locked